The Drake curse has struck again. Seems like the Drake curse has made its way back into the UFC as Sean Strickland went on to lose to Drake du Plessis for the belt after Drake put $700,000 on Sean Strickland to win. Now, whether or not Drake du Plessis actually won or not is up for debate, but what isn't up for debate is that $700,000 has practically disappeared. Sean Strickland is no longer the champ, and this adds another inaccurate pick to the collection of bad picks Drake has made. So today, let's find out if Aubrey Drake Graham is controlling the UFC timeline through his atrociously bad picks and some sort of curse, and let's find out if there's a correlation between his bets and his picks and what actually happens in fights. But before we begin, I wanted to note that the Drake curse seems to be prevalent in all sports, but because we're a fighting channel, we're only going to be specifically looking into his bets on fights and also mainly MMA and UFC events. So starting off, you might remember the first time the Drake curse gained popularity in the UFC was when Conor McGregor faced Khabib, which we'll talk about later in this video. But the Drake curse, from what I found, goes back even further when Conor was still a featherweight and was first fighting for the title against Jose Aldo in 2015. Drake had put $500,000 on Jose Aldo to win when essentially the odds were 50-50. And to Drake's credit, I do think that most conservative and long-term UFC fans at the time had Jose Aldo winning this fight, mainly because of his dominance at the featherweight division at the time. But nonetheless, Drake cursed this fight for Jose Aldo, and Conor went on to win in record-breaking time. And of course, speaking of Conor McGregor, when Conor fought Khabib in 2018, like mentioned before, when Drake supported his friend Conor and even flew the man's flag at weigh-ins, Conor met his maker in Khabib in that fight and got absolutely destroyed. But of course, Khabib was obviously the betting favorite, with him being a sizable favorite at that, but still, Drake went on to practically curse Conor. Now let's skip forward to 2022 when things would really start to heat up and Drake would start to make a lot of big public bets on UFC fights. Starting off, when Jorge Masvidal faced his former friend and teammate Colby Covington, Drake backed his friend in Jorge Masvidal with $275,000, who was at the time a pretty big underdog, closing at around plus 250. And as we all know, Jorge Masvidal would go on to lose this fight in practically every single round, as Colby Covington dominated this fight from start to finish, and this would kick off Drake's horrendously bad streak of picks. Literally 2 months later, Drake tried his luck again and put $400,000 on Justin Gaethje to win over Charles Oliveira, who was the slight favorite by most accounts, but we all know how this fight ended. Skipping over to UFC 278, Drake would make two really bad picks that would cost him almost $500,000. Starting off, Drake would lose $240,000 when he bet on Jose Aldo to win over Merab when he was a slight underdog, and well, Jose got absolutely shut down due to Merab's wrestling. In that same event, Drake would lose another $200,000 on Kamaru Usman as he bet Kamaru to win over Leon Edwards in their second fight in the UFC, and granted, Kamaru was a pretty sizable favorite to win. But of course, the Drake curse would overpower those sizable odds as Kamaru Usman would go on to lose in quite possibly the craziest way you can lose a fight. And speaking of the craziest and most shocking ways you can lose fights, let's talk about Drake betting on Israel Adesanya. Firstly, let's talk about how Drake lost a gargantuan $2 million on Israel Adesanya when he bet on Izzy to win over his rival in Alex Pereira in their first fight in the UFC. Of course, Izzy was a sizable favorite at around minus 220 odds and looked like the favorite for 4.8 rounds until Alex's left hook happened and made Izzy disappear and made Drake's $2 million disappear. And going into another upset loss, Drake put $500,000 on Izzy to win via KO against Sean Strickland, who was a gigantic plus 450 underdog, while Izzy was a monster minus 650 favorite. And well, if this doesn't scream curse, I don't know what does. Drake and his curse really might be responsible for two of the biggest upsets in UFC history. Now on to something a little more positive. When Colby Covington fought Leon last year, Drake did pick the winner of this fight correctly. However, he still lost $250,000 because he bet on Leon to win via KO, which would have netted him $1.2 million had he won. And most recently, of course, Drake put $700,000 on Sean Strickland to win, and he would go on to lose as Drake du Plessis won this fight in a very close split decision. Now going into non-MMA or UFC events, Drake put $250,000 on Nate Diaz to win against Jake Paul in their boxing match, and not only did Nate lose, he got dropped pretty bad and didn't look good in this fight at all. Speaking of Jake Paul, before this fight, Drake put $400,000 on Jake Paul to beat Tommy Fury by KO, who was a slight underdog at around plus 130. And well, Jake got close in that last round, but ultimately lost the fight and lost Drake $400,000. And speaking of boxing matches, I think the worst example of the curse was when Drake posed with Anthony Joshua, and Joshua even tweeted in the post of the picture, quote, "Bout to break the curse," which, if you're good with dates, literally led to one of the biggest upsets in boxing and maybe of all of combat sports history, when Andy Ruiz did the unthinkable and KO'd and upset the champ. Mind you, Andy Ruiz was a preposterous plus 1,125 underdog, and Joshua was a minus 2,100 favorite, which further solidifies some sort of curse. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the boxing match in Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou. And even though Francis Ngannou looked really good in this fight and was really a winner in terms of money in this fight, he still went on to lose this fight after he posted a picture with Drake, and again, still technically a loss for Drake. Now, as bad as the Drake curse has looked in the fight game, he has had some wins. Drake didn't actually bet on this fight, but he took a picture with Max Holloway before his fight against Brian Ortega, and not only did Max win and break the curse, he had probably one of his most iconic performances and destroyed Brian Ortega in a striking masterclass. Drake also finally won a huge amount of money on Israel Adesanya when he bet on Izzy to win over Alex Pereira in their rematch in the UFC, and won both the bet for Izzy to win straight up and for Izzy to win via KO, which more than made up for the $500,000 he lost on Jorge in the same event to win and KO Gilbert Burns. Drake also won huge with a dual bet on Paddy the Baddy and Molly the Meatball when he bet $2.2 million and won $3.3 million when they both finished their opponents that night. And this was probably the best win on Drake's record, but he also predicted that John Jones was going to win over Cyril Gane by submission when he put $250,000 on that bet and won huge with $1.7 million. Granted, he also put $250,000 on John Jones to win via KO, but obviously Drake still profited big. Now, where Drake didn't profit big is when we look at his total losses, which in USD is about $5.7 million. Now, the big silver lining is that when he does win pretty big, and his total wins comes out to about $4 million USD. I did round to the nearest 100,000 when it came to his wins, but that comes out to a total of really $1.7 million in losses, and in actuality, he's probably lost zero money or probably made money because he's sponsored by Stake, which is the place he makes his bets. So how truly bad is Drake at predicting fights? Well, if we crunch the numbers, Drake is a total of 5-13 when it comes to who he supports or who he bets on and who actually wins the fights, which is essentially 27% accuracy. And that's really, really bad considering if you were just to blind pick fighters, technically the expected value of your accuracy should be around 50%. Now, to Drake's credit, he does often take the underdog or the unfavorited bet, like in the case of Colby versus Leon when he took Leon to win via KO. So it would kind of make sense as to why his total accuracy rate is so low. However, when we only take a look at Drake's bets when he does take the favorited bet, his record is still really bad at 4-5, which is 44% accuracy. However, this is pretty bad even though it's closer to 50% because he is technically taking the favorited bet, meaning he should be winning more often than not or above 50%. Now, before some egghead statistician says the data is skewed and the numbers are wrong, yes, they're probably wrong and the data is probably skewed because I tried to create a sample size based on the internet, and of course the internet is going to push that Drake loses his bets more so than he wins so that they could push the Drake curse narrative because obviously it's very interesting. However, based on this data alone and the sample size I created, a 27% accuracy rate and 44% accuracy rate on favorites is crazy bad. But considering that whenever Drake does take the favorite, it usually ends up in historically some of the craziest upsets in combat sports history, I'm pretty inclined to say the Drake curse is real. And if I were a betting man, if Drake is picking that fight, I would take the opposite. And I know there's probably no correlation or causation between Drake and outcomes of fights, but in my opinion, based on these numbers, the Drake curse is real. Anyways, what do you guys think about the Drake curse? Is it real? Is it not? And have you been betting against Drake and making money? Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next week. Peace.